we ask these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen. For $30, you can leave this building today after service. You can drive down the streets to Barnes & Noble, and you can pay for books that contain wisdom of some of modern secularism's best thinkers. I know because I've done it. And if you do, you can find ideas like this. Why don't we make ourselves the last generation on earth? If we would all agree to have ourselves sterilized, then no sacrifices would be required. We could party our way into extinction. Of course, it'd be impossible to get agreement on universal sterilization, but just imagine that we could. Then, is there anything wrong with this scenario? This is Steven Pinker once again, and he's revived an argument proposed by German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who reasoned that because of human suffering, bringing any children into a world where the odds are more likely that they will suffer, reproducing should be considered a moral wrong. Pinker summarizes the position this way. He says, everyone will suffer to some extent. And if our species continues to reproduce, we can be sure that some future children will suffer severely. Hence, continued reproduction will harm some children severely and benefit no one. Now, Pinker fancies himself more reasonable than to actually advocate for this position, but he does think it's worth considering. Here's his conclusion. Justifying the choice to have children forces us to reconsider the deep issues of suffering. Is life worth living? Are the interests in a future child a sufficient reason to bring that child into existence? And is the continuance of our species justifiable in the face of our knowledge that it will certainly bring suffering to innocent future human beings? Now, for Pinker, the burden is on those who want kids to justify such a decision for continuing our species given human suffering. Now, if the proposal of universal sterilization is a shock to you, if that hits you as absurd, I want to point out that it actually wasn't Pinker or Schopenhauer or other humanists to suggest this first. In fact, the proposal is first made by Solomon in our passage this morning. Look down at Ecclesiastes 4, verses 2 to 3. His conclusion, after what he said throughout our passages, I thought, that is, I came to the conclusion. Here's the conclusion he came to. The dead who are already dead are more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are under the sun. Solomon's conclusion for us this morning, it is good to be dead. It's even better to have never been born. Unlike Pinker, who still thinks life is worth living, even though there is no God, Solomon is bold enough to take his secularist observation to its conclusion. If God does not exist, then based on what we can observe, death and non-existence are better than life. To bring another child into the world is wrong. Well, what would lead Solomon to make such a statement? I realize this is probably not your norm for a sermon on Sunday morning. Well, 2 weeks ago, we looked at the preacher's famous song about time. There's a time for everything, right? And we saw that the song was not a celebration of all the diverse opportunities we have under the sun. Rather, that song at the beginning of the chapter was reflecting on the fact that all of those rhythms of life are inescapable. Time is actually demonstrating man has no advantage under the sun. We're not breaking free of any pattern. Every generation is walking through the same rhythms, the same roller coasters, its ups and downs. Every generation is bound to it. Love and laughter, death and war, killing and destruction, laughing and rejoicing. Man has made no progress out of those rhythms. That's the point of verses 1 to 8. We live in a world where every generation experiences those same characteristics throughout society. And our passage is an extension of that song. See it there in verse 17? Look at how it concludes. He cites the song again. He says, "For there is a time for every matter and for every work." It's nearly a restatement of Ecclesiastes 3, verse 1, the introduction of the song. For everything there's a season and a time for every matter under heaven. So our passage today is a continuation of his reflection on there being a time for everything, which leads the preacher to make a perilous observation at the outset of this passage, down in verse 16. What does he observe? "Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness even there was wickedness." Now, if you remember, the author is the king. He's one of the sons of David, from the line of David. And so he is the king over Israel. And he's reflecting on what he often saw, that in the place where justice and righteousness were meant to go forth in Israel, instead of seeing equitable and just and right decisions, he often observed unjust, corrupt, and greedy rulings. That is, it's as if children, if you were to install a faucet, maybe your dad installs a faucet this afternoon, and he hooks up the hot and cold water lines, only when you turn the cold water on, you get hot water, and when you turn the hot knob, you get cold water. Everything's backwards is what he's saying. Only in this case, he's not observing a faucet, he's observing government. In human experience, government is often a source of wickedness when it is meant to be a place for justice and righteousness. As one commentator put it, what the king is reflecting on, in Israel, the place of judgment was the administration of justice practiced by the elders in the city gates. That is, like when Moses couldn't handle the burden of judging disputes between all of Israel, Jethro advised him to organize the elders who could share the load and offer just and equitable rulings so that the people would experience justice in the community. That's what's going on here. As I was studying this passage, Joe brought my attention to Deuteronomy 1, verse 16, and here's the instruction God gave to Israel's judges. It says, "And I charged your judges at that time, hear the cases between your brothers, and judge righteously between a man and his brother, or the alien who is with him. You shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not be intimidated by anyone, for the judgment is God's." So God gave Israel his law, his Torah. That is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, so that they would apply it in their community and be a picture of the world of the wisdom of God, what it really means to be a just human society. That is, Israel's government was meant to be built by God's law to show that there was something unique in the law of Israel that only God could give. But what happened? As many of you know, the law goes forth perverted throughout the life of Israel. A great book that explains this is Habakkuk. Habakkuk 1 verse 4, he's lamenting what's going on. He says, "So the law, the Torah, is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted." And those of you who know your Old Testament realize that theocratic Israel was a total failure. The people who were given God's legal code used their positions of power to fill their pockets, they neglected the poor, and they perverted worship. And our preacher today is thinking back on his time as king and reflecting on all that he observed. Verse 16, what he saw, remember he's operating by empiricism, and so what his eyes observed is that in the place of justice, where the rulings were to go forth, instead there was wickedness. In the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. What he's observing is, so often under the sun, the normative human experience is that we receive wickedness and injustice from one another. What Solomon is saying should make Christians some of the quickest to say, injustice is a normal experience under the sun. We should recognize that. Solomon is telling us here what he observed in Israel while he was king was that so often where there should have been righteousness and just treatment of one another, instead there was abuse, partiality, and corruption. And quite often we know that that wickedness comes through those in power, human leadership, and human government. And so what he's saying in this passage is that if chapter 3's song is correct, which he thinks it is, then his secularism must draw one conclusion. Human beings will not be able to solve the problem of injustice and oppression themselves. So his conclusion by chapter 4, verses 2 to 3, is given what he's observed, given the fact that no system has put out wickedness, it is better to be dead or to have never been born. He's saying, what's the point in trying? The deck's already set. Right? Children will do it this way. After this, we'll have a race after church. Any children want to have a race? What we'll do is and some adults, we're going to get everybody to line up outside after church. Children, you think you can beat the adults? Do you? Maybe, possibly. Here's the deal. The adults all get to drive their cars. Seems like it's not worth competing, is it? Because we know who's going to win. What he's saying is, it's better not to compete in this game of life because it's only going to deal us injustice. Which begs the question, why is there injustice? He's now going to meditate on the purpose, or really why injustice exists in this world. Now, if you're familiar at all with apologetics, you'll know that Lewis for some time argued that God took a risk in creating free creatures, and that's the reason injustice exists in the world today. Now, I love Lewis, but I think sometimes we're too quick to use that explanation because we feel the need to get God off the hook. But I want to ask you to look down at what the preacher does in answering this question. He has no intention of relieving such pressure for the unbelieving world. In fact, he thinks that injustice is something that the unbelieving world needs to be confronted with, and they don't need to get God off the hook. Rather, they need to learn that God is teaching them something. Look at verse 18. I said in my heart, with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see they are but beasts. Why is there injustice, he says? Well, the preacher says, for life under the sun, God is using injustice to test humanity. Paul says the same thing in Romans chapter 8. It says, the creation is awaiting eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but by God. Test here, though, is not like an examination. It's not so that God can see what's in you or me. He's not trying to figure something out. Test here is meant to expose, to reveal the quality of what's going on, to shed light on, to confront someone with the truth. But notice who needs to see the test. What does this say? Who's the test for? It's so that they, that is mankind, would see what they are made of. They would see ultimately that they are but beasts. So the reason injustice exists, as Solomon observes, is there is something that you need to see about yourself. There's something that I need to see about myself. If I want to be an atheist, the conclusion that is being forced upon me by the inescapable reality of injustice is that we are nothing but beasts. We don't have a better answer than the animals. By looking at the injustice of the world, we are disarmed of the optimism of secular humanism. We stop looking to mankind to answer the problem of injustice. Injustice forces us to see that there are massive parallels between the way fallen creatures treat each other and the way animals treat each other. It reveals that human dominion has failed. our generation, our militaries, our government structures, they will not rid the world of injustice. And when we realize that, we realize that our rule is essentially no more effective than if we were governed by dogs. So I ask this morning, have you learned the lesson of injustice? Have the walls of suburbia persuaded us that we have gained an edge on injustice? Have we set our hopes and been confused to think because of our time of ease here that we have truly begun to create a better world? Has our temporary moment of affluence and the common grace gifts of police and courts of accountability led us to assume that we truly have effectively begun to put evil away? I want to commend to you this morning that the preacher would have you despair and realize that if human beings and human wisdom and humanism and secularism are the way we're going to try to put out injustice, it is better for us to die or to never have been born. 4 reasons why that we're going to learn this morning. 4 lessons to learn from injustice. Look at starting at verse 19. First lesson is that injustice shows us that man's justice has no advantage. Verse 19. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. You see the word advantage there? That's what he's looking for in Ecclesiastes 1 verse 3. His question is, what advantage is there to all our toil under the sun? And the point that he's making with regards to justice is that human beings are no better at advancing the cause of justice than animals. We can do no better than the animal kingdom because our fate is now just like the animals who will return to the ground. Like the animals, we demonstrate ourselves not to be over time, but to be those who are recipients of what happens in time. We can't choose not to have injustice exist. It's going to happen to us just as it happens to everyone else. We share the same life experience as the beasts, and therefore we have no advantage over the animals. 2 months ago, I received a text while I was at work. Lauren had just pulled into the driveway, and if you've been here long enough, you've heard enough of these stories. But yes, our chickens all died again. And she was texting me because as she pulled up, 2 dogs had ripped open the chain link fence and eaten all but one of our chickens. Now, I did not go looking through the woods for a council of bears who enact justice on those dogs. And the fact is, there is no council among the animals to settle those disputes. Nate had reminded me of a documentary where it was showing the eagles. They would fly up the sides of the mountains and they would grab the baby goats. And it wasn't because the baby goats were cute. The eagle would grab the baby goats, it would soar up even higher, and what would it do? It would drop the goats so that they would fall to their death and then be eaten. There's no justice in the animal kingdom. We've even come up with a name to smooth over it in our minds, haven't we? What do we call that? It's the circle of life. It's much cuter that way when we add Disney music to it. But because we are out of Eden, human justice is no better. We are stuck in the same circle of life. We think it cruel to the eagle to treat the baby goat so callously, while in our own nation, millions of men this afternoon will view explicit videos of children and women who have been enslaved for the production of such content because of the money they can make off of it. It's estimated that every year, 15 to 50,000 new children and women are forced into sex slavery in our nation. And it's horrifying if you consider how many Americans consume it. A 2022 report suggests that there were more than 27.6 million reported global trafficking cases in 2021. Yes, we experience relief from human governments here and there, but in the end, human justice has little advantage over the beasts. And some of you know this well. I've heard your stories. I've heard your sufferings. Human injustice is inescapable because our justice brings no advantage. The second reason for injustice in verse 20 is to show us that we are cursed. See, if they all go to one place, all being animals and humans, all are from the dust, and to dust all return. That is, like the beast, all human beings are going to return to the grave. Dust is a reference back to Genesis, and to be returned to dust is to communicate to us the reality of decreation. The beautiful scene in Genesis 2 is now falling apart before us with every death. To be returned to the place from which we were made is to suggest a reversal of what God has done. But Psalm 90 laments that we don't learn from it. He says, God returns man to dust and says, "Return, O children of man." Who considers the lessons of death? It is often by injustice that we observe the reality of the curse. We are returned back to the dust. Its message for us is that we are outside of Eden, and like Abel, we return to the dust under a curse. The third thing that injustice teaches us is the limitation of human knowledge. Human beings cannot offer or guarantee justice because they don't know everything, verses 21 to 22. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? See, facing morality as being brought to us by being in a cursed world, we have to come to grips with the fact that we don't know what happens the moment our body dies. Now remember, he's operating as a secularist. So he's speaking by what he observes. And if he looks around and he sees what happens, all he can say is that when somebody dies, they're just not there anymore. That's the only thing he can say. So any secularist who goes beyond that and says, well, at death nothing happens, you're going beyond what you can see. What he's saying there is we just don't know. We don't know what happens at death if we're going to be secularists living by what we can observe. If we live by what we can see under a microscope, then no one can make any assertions about what happens at death. And there are two realities implied by these verses that Solomon wants to flesh out. Number one, many people die having never received or experienced justice in this life. Many men, many women, many children will go to their graves having experienced injustice, and it will not be resolved. And so, two, the second implication he's bringing out is he's asking that question, does man go up and do the beasts go down? We don't know. That is, we don't know if justice happens afterwards. And what he's trying to flesh out there is that there is absolutely no reason to place your trust in human beings to guarantee justice. They can't guarantee it before you die, and they can't make any promises about what happens after you die. So the reality of injustice forces us to look at human wisdom and say, we don't know, we can't solve it. Learn that we are but beasts is the point of injustice. The fourth lesson is that because of these things, we're to learn that human beings and their efforts can bring no comfort to those who experience injustice. Mankind cannot bring true and lasting comfort. Ecclesiastes 4, verse 1. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the one side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. He's making three observations. Number one, I think he's saying that if you and I could see all the oppressions that existed in the world, we would despair. And what he's doing is he's forcing himself to look at them. He says, I saw the tears of the oppressed. But the second thing he observes is he gazes at the oppressors. And who is it that they often are? Well, it's those in power, he says. Power's on their side. The oppressors in this life often seem to be winning. Psalm 73. It seems like the route in this world is to be on the side of evil and wickedness. They always seem to be winning. That's his observation. Power's on their side. And the great and terrible news is that he repeats that conclusion twice. Therefore, there is no one to comfort the oppressed. What can we say to them? And that's terrible. I can't guarantee that justice will be had in this situation. You may have to go to the grave without your cause ever being rectified. You may not see justice accomplished in this lifetime. Since man cannot say what happens at death, apart from God, there is no promise that we can make that can guarantee those who face injustice will be comforted. We can't guarantee it. We can hope for it. We can labor to produce a just society in as much as we can, but at the end of the day, we realize human power can't accomplish it. This is what Isaiah was getting at when the Lord told him to comfort his people. And Isaiah's looking around at all the humans in front of him, and he says, "What on earth do I say? All flesh is grass. Its beauty like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows on it." What am I going to say to people if I'm using human beings to accomplish justice? It might work. Banking on man to fix the cause of injustice is no better than walking outside to our courtyard and pleading with the grass to put an end to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This world is no Disneyland, folks. Going by what we observe, many of the weak, the orphaned, the poor, the widows are taken advantage of, and many will not receive comfort from the system set up by mankind. We will do our best, and we will relieve some issues, but we will not solve it. We do some good. We ask our governments of justice, but it isn't enough. King David in Psalm 108, when Israel is attacked from the south by the Edomites, cries out, "Worthless is the salvation of man." He's saying that as the highest power in the land. It'd be a pretty awful thing when you're sitting there with all the military commanders. You're asking David what we're going to do, and he's telling you as the highest force in Israel, mankind is a worthless hope for salvation. But David spoke the truth. Jeremiah 17, verse 5. "Cursed is the man who trusts in man, who makes his flesh strength." So in summary, what the lesson of injustice teaches us is that like everything else under the sun, injustice has its allotted time, and it's there to teach us four things. Number one, our justice has no advantage in the big scheme. Number two, it's because we're cursed. Number three, therefore, we cannot know by our own observations whether or not justice will ultimately be accomplished. Number four, this means man cannot offer any true comfort from human structures. And if that's all I had to say, we might understand Pinker's point, right? It seems that Pinker's suggestion for universal sterilization is not such a bad idea if he's looking at the same world as King Solomon. That was his conclusion, verses 2 to 3. If all there is mankind to answer the injustices in this lifetime, then verse 2, it's better to go ahead and be dead, or verse 3, it's better to never exist at all. If you want to be an atheist, you want to go by what you can observe and measure, then the right conclusion is that the realities of injustice in this world mean the consistent secularist should conclude life is not worth living. And thus we begin to understand why in Canada they have suicide pods and why there are people starting to use them. I'm not saying I agree with it, but if I see King Solomon's perspective, if I only live life by what I see under the sun, then there's a way to rationalize it, which I would disagree with. So I wonder here if you are a Christian and you cannot fathom that someone would feel this way today. In your minds right now, your defenses are going up. Well, if you think this is so bad, go to a third world country. But my brothers and sisters, this book is not some teen on TikTok sharing her story because she cut her bangs too short and it went viral. This is Israel's king, the wisest king in the land, telling us these things. And he's reminding us that thoughts of despair are very common and fitting under the sun. we of all people should not be surprised when our fellow human beings hate life here. We must be careful. Even in all the gifts that we've received of common grace under the sun, we live in a time of affluence. We do have a time of unusual justice in our land. But we must be very careful not to write off the despair felt by so many. America will not succeed where Solomon and the Torah failed. So we should give thanks for the good we've accomplished. But as believers, this book is our standard. So we should be able to say with Solomon, our government, our militaries, and our structure will not solve the realities of evil and injustice. This is what we call an eternal critique. It's where you take the assumptions of someone and you ask them to be consistent with their conclusion. Solomon is being the consistent secularist. He's saying, I'm going only by what I can observe, and that's the conclusion that I come to. But that's not all, because Solomon, at the end of the day, isn't a secularist. But if secularism is true, verse 19 is the conclusion, right? There's that word again, vanity. We cannot make progress. It's an enigma. We can't solve this. It's all vanity. And you'll remember that word vanity, or that word for enigma or vanity is hebel, a vapor. It's trying to solve the reality of injustice is like giving a kid a net and telling him to go catch the fog. And you'll remember also, though, that word for hebel there is the Hebrew name for Abel from Genesis 4. Genesis 4 is the example of what happens now that we are outside of the Garden of Eden. The normative human experience under the sun is that we see lives often conclude like Abel's. The Cains of this world seem to be winning. So what's the point? But you'll notice here in verse 17 that the preacher also introduces the conclusion of his book. If you look at your sermon handout, you'll see the thesis for the book of Ecclesiastes, and you'll see that what the way the preacher's teaching is summarized is that every deed will enter into judgment. That is, all the secrets and the deeds of men will be exposed. So down in verse 17, though he's going to chase secularism for a few more verses, verse 17 unpacks his faith-filled response of how to live in a world where injustice has allotted time. Verse 17, I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. Do you see what he's doing? If injustice has been allotted a time under the sun, what else has been given time? Justice. While injustice has been allotted time today, there is a day allotted for injustice to be swallowed up by justice. So if there is time for injustice, the conclusion is that God has also allotted time where he will answer every act of injustice. And so we go back to Genesis 4 for a moment. You think about Abel. There was no salvation for him in the hands of men. But do you remember who speaks first? God. Genesis 4 verse 10, what have you done? And the Lord said, the voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. That is, there is a God in whom every injustice, every bit of bloodshed, every oppression, he hears it, and he is going to hold it accountable. Brothers and sisters, God is a just God. He's an avenging God. There is one who hears the cries of the oppressed. There's one who sees every deed. Since time is not random but allotted, just as we cannot escape the subjects of verses 1 to 8, injustice will not be able to escape justice when the Lord comes. There is one who has set a time in which Cain and everyone else who has ever played the role of the oppressor will be measured, will be exposed, and will be judged by God himself. In summary, what the preacher is getting at is God will provide the justice that human governments cannot. It is absolutely true. to look at what's going on around the world, possibly even in your own life, to see and accept there are realities of injustices, and we should fight them in as much as we can. But at the end of the day, if all there is to answer injustice is us, we should despair. But brothers and sisters, we have a word from the Lord. He will hold every injustice accountable. And while this is a comfort, it's also a confrontation, isn't it? It means that the real terror of this passage is not that you and I have fallen into a world where there is injustice, but that each and every one of us will fall into the hands of the living God. See, if I am zealous for justice against my fellow human beings, I must also be zealous for justice against myself. Because if God is going to hold them accountable and measure all of their deeds, He is also going to call my lies, my lusts, my envies, my slanders, my hateful thoughts to account. And this is why the Apostle Paul, years later, is so eager to tell us about another king. He wants to tell you about King Jesus, who himself died at the hands of men. But strangely, while his death under the sun was from a system of injustice, his death before God was an act of great and holy justice. You see, when Jesus came into the world to put on human flesh, he did that to identify as a sinner. He congregated with sinners. He was friends with corrupt tax collectors. He was friends with skeptical disciples, duplicitous adulterers, because that's all there are. That's who's in this room. But Paul says in Romans 3, verse 25, the cross proves something about God. In 3 verse 25, Jesus went to the cross, it says, to show God's righteousness, to demonstrate the justice of his government, because in God's divine forbearance, he passed over former sins. That is, it looked as if God would not be just. But in the crucifixion of Christ, it shows God's righteousness at the present time, so that God would be both just, upholding the demands of the law, and justifier, that is, satisfying in an act of mercy so that sinners could become saints, so that those who recognize their sin through repentance look to Jesus and realize that in God, mercy is available to them. He is both just and justifier of you who believe. So you see, when you're tempted to say that God must be unjust because he's not yet dealt with injustice, we fail to realize that that also includes holding our sin accountable. But brothers and sisters, the reality is Jesus has died. Number one, to answer the question of injustice. So will sin be answered? Absolutely. Look at the cross. It's why it was so brutal. It's why he quotes Psalm 22 and experiences in some mysterious way an abandonment from the Father. The brutal treatment of Jesus at the hands of men is portraying the offense or the stench of sin before God. It demonstrates our own rejection of God and our hatred towards one another. The cross demonstrates God will not let sin go free. But number two, it also upholds justice. It upholds justice because Jesus identifies with you and me. Jesus becomes a justifier of those who believe, meaning you can look forward to justice and not fear because you hope in the Lord. So in summary, friend, God is a just God. There is no reality in which injustice goes free. There is no reality in which injustice gets the last word. Life is worth living, as he says down there at the end of chapter 3, that we should rejoice in our work. That is, we should be able to give thanks for our days because we know ultimately justice will have the final word, because every deed will be measured before God. That means you and I have two options. Number one, we can go to the secular route, which leads only to despair. Or number two, we can realize that by hearing this message today, God is having mercy on us by summoning us to repent and look to Jesus Christ. Those who wait on Christ's return will receive his justice as an act of mercy, and you will not be put to shame if you place your final hope for justice not in the systems of men, but in God, who will judge every deed. A few applications to close. Number one, we of all people should be skeptical of human solutions to bring lasting justice. Number two, as those made in the image of God and those who look to our God who is a just king, we should care about justice in this life and advocate it as we have responsibility and opportunity in our spheres. Number three, we should prepare our children and our young to understand the realities of injustice, even as they experience it in small and immature ways. Number four, as a church, we should cultivate an ear for the cries of the oppressed. We of all people profess the heart of mankind to be evil, so we should be the quickest not to be shocked when our fellow human beings cry out that they have been mistreated. So I ask, as a church, are we known for our ability to listen to people who feel this way? Are we a place where those who have suffered at the hands of others feel that they can come and find compassion? Or are we those who are immediately skeptical? Oh, hush, go somewhere else. That didn't really happen. It's not as bad as you say. Do they find in us a people who say, I know sin. I know my own heart. And I know how quickly injustice can spread. And I will listen. And it doesn't mean I'm immediately going to act, but I will hear. And I will labor. And I will fight for you in as much as I can. But ultimately, we'll point them to Jesus, right? Number 5. Because of the reality of injustice and the inability of human hands to solve this, church, we should be prepared to tell people about Jesus Christ, who not only died in the sinner's place, but now promises to return for his people and issue perfect justice. We are a people waiting for that day in which the Lord will return, and then he will establish his eternal kingdom forever, where sin and injustice will be no more. I'll just close with the words of Psalm 96 that we had for our opening call to worship. It exhorts us, church. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. Yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. Let the heavens be glad, and let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar and all that fills it. Let the field exult and everything in it. Then shall all the trees of the forest sing for joy before the Lord comes. For he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness.